tremendous interest for this talk, and so I know that it's a really exciting time to launch the new initiative in which this is situated, the Transnational Gender and Labor Working Group. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Chung, and I'm faculty in Asian American Studies, Labor Studies, and the International Institute. And today we have Professor Elena Shih from Brown University to discuss her amazing new book, Manufacturing Freedom. Before introducing Professor Shih and her brilliant book, I wanted to share some information about the Transnational Gender and Labor Working Group, which has convened this event today. This working group is a joint initiative between CSW Streisand Center and the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, IRLE. And really our goal is to advance the interdisciplinary study of gender, labor, collective organizing, and global capitalism with a diverse community of faculty, students, and community-based organizers and researchers, both at UCLA and beyond. So we're officially launching today, and I can really think of no better person to launch us than Elena Shih, whose critical ethnographic research and deep commitment to scholar activism really embodies and expresses everything that the Transnational Gender and Labor Working Group hopes to do. So in addition to today's public book talk, Elena Shih will join organizers from the Los Angeles Sex Workers Outreach Project to discuss the powerful documentary film Flying Power, which will screen tomorrow, and some of you might have tickets at the Darren Star Theater, about the social justice collective Red Canary Song, which Elena is a core collective member of, and is led by Asian diasporic massage workers, sex workers, and allies committed to a radical practice of grassroots organizing through mutual aid. So before I introduce Professor Shih and the book, I want to just thank so many people who really helped make this space, Elena's travels, all the food we have today, and all the kind of the little things that we don't think about that go into putting together an event. So I want to begin by thanking Hannah Appel, who is the coordinator of the Anthropology Department's Culture, Power, and Social Change Colloquium Series, and is co-sponsoring today's event. Thanks for sharing this space, and also to Victor Sepulveda, Siva Losakal, and Paul Connor for working with us to accommodate overflow. I also want to thank the International Institute, the Sociology Department, and the Theater, Film, and Television School for their support as co-sponsors for our two-day event series. I really can't imagine putting together a series of this scale without the extraordinary team. I'm talking extraordinary team at CSW Streisand Center, without whom none of this would be happening today. Katya Antoine, I think, okay, probably outside taking care of everything so that we can have a smooth event. Rosa Chung and Rosie Grant, truly a joy to work with and show us the serious chops that feminist organizers bring to creating such vibrant spaces of community exchange. I also want to thank CSW Streisand Director Grace Hong and IRLE Director Toby Higby for their incredible support of the working group, and we'll continue to program events like this, and I hope that you can continue to join us. And last and certainly not least, I want to thank the extraordinary Esther Kim, the MA for the working group, who's really pivotal to also today. So now to the main event. Elena Shih is Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University, where she directs a human trafficking research cluster through the Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Elena is the author of two books, Manufacturing Freedom, Sex Work, Anti-Trafficking, Rehab, and the Racial Wages of Rescue, published this year by UC Press, and also a co-edited volume, White Supremacy, Racism, and the Coloniality of Anti-Trafficking. Elena serves on numerous editorial boards, has written influential co-ops, including a fantastic co-op in New York Times, and has won awards for her exemplary research, teaching, and a community-engaged service. And she has close ties to Southern California, to this building, to our campus, returning today after earning a PhD in sociology here and a BA at Pomona Studies. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Elena, to begin what I hope is a really vibrant conversation about this really stunning book and the ethnographic research that was part of it, as well as just the deep implications it has for all of us who are really thinking about the intersections of gender, sexuality, transnationalism, militarism, and global capitalism. In the spirit and tradition of CPSC, we'll begin the Q&A, inviting grad students. In anthropology, but any of the grad students here, and I want to give a shout out to Asian American Studies, our grad students here, to begin the line of questioning, and then we'll open it up to faculty. So with that, help join me in giving a warm welcome to Elena Shih.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Congratulations to IRLE on the incredible launch of the Transnational Gender and Labor Working Group. There are so many ways in which this talk is so completely full circle. Formally, namely that this book was written downstairs, one floor below us. But the Institute for Research on Labor Employment, Center for the Study of Women, and International Institute were many of my intellectual homes. I'm so grateful that Chris Tilley is here in the audience today, so I can properly thank him now, but also in the talk, you'll see a glimpse of Chris. Thanks so much to all the sponsors, CSW, IRLE, Department of Anthropology, International Institute, Department of Sociology. I owe so many debts, of course, to my wonderful advisors, to the training I received in this department, to the wonderful students who I got to teach, but also who I learned immensely from. But in particular, I also want to thank two people who are in this room. In the 6 or 7 years that I was here, I was so lucky to be a student affairs officer at the Scholarship Resource Center. Its director, Angela Deaver Campbell, has worked for over 2 decades to make education at UCLA affordable. So if there are undergrads in this room, please see Angela and her amazing team at the SRC on amazing information about how to find and get scholarships. And then, most importantly, I think as advice for all of us who are in academia, who are working within the walls of UCLA, you have to find your community outside of it. And so I have so much to thank for endless friends and family who can't be here. But in particular, I want to thank Tony Ochoa for being here, for being the light and music and great dancing of my life, who always asked me probing non-academic questions, and who always caught me when I fell out of the stairs of Haines Hall. So this past summer, it was a summer of blockbuster hits, and alongside Barbie and Oppenheimer, an unexpected independent film gripped the nation's curiosities and earned over $140 million in ticket sales during its opening weekend on July 4th. The Sound of Freedom follows the life of anti-trafficking crusader Tim Ballard, who rose to fame after leaving his job in Homeland Security and as a former Navy SEAL to found an organization dedicated to rescuing child victims of sex trafficking. Tim Ballard is an interesting character to understand the world of power, influence, and profit involved in anti-trafficking work. He built Operation Underground Railroad seemingly out of thin air in 2013, yet quickly rose to such influence and expertise that by 2017, he was invited by then President Donald Trump to sit on the White House's anti-trafficking task force, and by 2023 had amassed a $53 million annual budget. It has attracted the most interesting and diverse followers, ranging from members of the Mormon Church to the Pittsburgh Steelers. In my book, Ballard appears in the chapters in Thailand, where I look into a 2017 trip Ballard took with conservative political commentator Glenn Beck, raving about their trip together, and particularly about having had a front and center seat with the Thai Department of Special Investigations, which is often referred to as Thai's FBI. We thought through a little bit about this curious coalition. Why, might you ask, does Thai's FBI want to sit down with Operation Underground Railroad? The longer and complicated answers are in this book, but in short, the organization promises to donate paramilitary manpower to foreign police forces through a cadre of former cops and ex-military that form their volunteer base. Separately, they use some of their multi-million-dollar annual budget to donate U.S. military defense and surveillance technologies to Thai law enforcement to aid their policing of trafficking. Operation Underground Railroad is among dozens of American nonprofits, journalists, academics, students, and others who have showed up in Thailand to rescue victims of trafficking. The tactics that these different American anti-trafficking groups use are varied. And while the unabashedly militaristic forms of intervention seen in the Operation Underground Railroad case are obvious, I want to turn to a softer side of rescue that on its surface satisfies so many desires in the global north. And to turn to that, I'll turn to some of my research on other anti-trafficking rescue projects in the region. Each Tuesday and Friday night on Cowboy Street, seen here, one of Bangkok's largest and well-known red light districts, a group of American missionaries embark in what they call human trafficking outreach ministry and ask the Holy Spirit's guidance in seeking broken women who might need their assistance. These women activists patronize go-go bars where Thai women dance on a maze of platforms and are adorned in everything from bondage gear to frilly lingerie. They're identified primarily by numbers taped to different parts of their bodies. And 8 years ago, I watched as missionary workers approached a worker named Pon, called her off the stage by pointing to her number, and informed her about an alternative employment opportunity making jewelry. They shared that if she was interested in leaving her job at the bar, she could submit an application to work at Cowboy Rescue, a socially entrepreneurial business that sells and markets jewelry made by quote-unquote survivors of human trafficking. Once her application for employment was accepted, Pon was ceremoniously handed a uniform, which she would be required to wear to work each day of the week. A black polo shirt with the NGO's emblem embroidered on the chest and the Thai word for freedom stitched across the right arm. In nearby Beijing, Chinese and expat missionaries visit massage parlors and hair salons in 2 red light districts and befriend Chinese sex workers through promises of English language lessons, health education, and friendship. Like in Thailand, sex workers are recruited to become jewelry makers at Freedom Footprints, an NGO that offers a monthly salary in exchange for jewelry production, in exchange for mandatory shelter housing, and different forms of moral and spiritual rehabilitation. Like Pon, a 26-year-old worker named Loyan now earns a minimum wage according to local Chinese standards, which is in fact a third to a fifth of what she formerly earned as a sex worker. Most importantly, Loyan and most of her coworkers do not consider themselves victims of trafficking, but the NGO that employs them does because they consider all sex work to be inherently exploitative and thus indistinguishable from human trafficking. Jewelry from both projects is sold 7,000 miles away through the bustling anti-trafficking movement here in the United States. Cowboy Rescue and Freedom Footprints are just 2 of a growing number of anti-trafficking projects that have turned to the market in order to raise funds and awareness around the issue of human trafficking. Freedom business is now an actual category of anti-trafficking work, though it has its roots in the interests of social enterprise, its roots in corporate social responsibility, and other kinds of public-private partnerships. My book exposes how these forms of market governance are rooted in gendered and racialized ideas of redemptive low-wage women's work. Organizations working from Thailand to Nepal to Peru, Moldova, Uganda, and in this case, an organization that works in Cambodia, now focus on selling the wares made by trafficking victims, what they often call, quote-unquote, slave-free goods. And this includes jewelry, tea, tote bags, cashmere scarves, blankets, and placemats. This turn to the market is not a path exclusive to faith-based organizations, of course. In the Asia-Pacific region alone, MTV Corporate launched a large social responsibility project to end exploitation and trafficking, which hosted large anti-trafficking rock concerts in popular shopping malls. Google, at one point, was the primary funder of the region's largest anti-trafficking hotline. And USAID and other donors collectively spend about $10 million a year on anti-trafficking efforts in the Asia-Pacific region. Competition for these funds is fierce and has created a veritable market in funding in what Laura Augustine has referred to as the human trafficking rescue industry, what Elizabeth Bernstein has labeled as redemptive capitalism, what the late, great sex worker rights activist Carol Lee has called the anti-trafficking industrial complex, and what legal scholar Janie Chuang has conceptualized as philanthrocapitalism. My book explores these different scholarly and activist provocations, asking how these forms of market governance appropriate low-wage women's work at the discursive and labor process levels. To telescope out a bit about trafficking, the global concern around trafficking has provoked a transnational justice movement formerly spearheaded in the year 2000 by the passing of the United Nations Palermo Protocol and the subsequent U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Two pieces of legislation that called for global attention by individual nation states to address human trafficking, and additionally added binding economic sanctions for nations that did not comply with a set of U.S. minimum standards. In 2008, China and Thailand both introduced landmark laws that scripted the global vocabulary around human trafficking into their domestic legal frameworks. But the differences between post-socialist authoritarian China and a more free market democratic Thailand create a theoretically compelling comparison to answer an additional research question of how and why have two American transnational social movement organizations thriving under drastically different state structures turned to the global market as a way of achieving social movement goals. So though the book takes very seriously the local sexual and labor politics and life in China and Thailand, it is also largely about how these forms of market governments and social enterprise offer us an opportunity to understand new forms of American soft power and humanitarian empire. Slogans that demand an end to quote-unquote modern-day slavery embody the seemingly straightforward goals to end human trafficking, but recent scholarship reveals multiple sources of conflict within the movement. Secular and rights-based organizations have focused on seeking justice for victims of all forms of labor exploitation, and they include sex work as a kind of labor. By contrast, prior research has found that a growing contingent of evangelical Christian organizations have co-opted the anti-trafficking movement to promote the sexual politics of new abolition, merely reframing a long-standing moral objection to sex work within the newer lens of anti-trafficking. More recently, Lindsay Buten's vital new book, Trafficking Anti-Blackness, helps us understand the false metaphor that links human trafficking with modern-day slavery. So while human trafficking appears in law, modern-day slavery is largely a social invention created by the anti-trafficking movement, created by American anti-trafficking NGOs to profit off of the emotional guilt around the transatlantic slave trade. But inherent in this bait and switch, Buten argues, is a fundamental erasure of the actual legacies of slavery, and in the case of my research, replacing the enslaved African with a far more palatable Asian sex slave. Abolitionist nostalgia is abundant in anti-trafficking work and is quite racist. The anti-trafficking organization Truckers Against Trafficking, which trains truck drivers to identify sex work happening in rest stops around the world, now has an annual Harriet Tubman Award that is awarded to a truck driver who successfully reports a case of sex work to the police. Similarly, you see the invocation of Harriet Tubman again in Operation Underground Railroad's work. where they say here that the namesake of the organization is a gesture to the path of freedom that Harriet Tubman and others led. Elsewhere, in a Cambodian American organization that claims to work with Cambodian victims of sex trafficking, they sell a William Wilberforce scarf for $29 that gestures to the abolitionist history of William Wilberforce. So the goals of this project were entirely learned, practiced, and inspired by the classes I took downstairs. So for those of you who are PhD students in Haines, you may be familiar with the 217 A, B, and C ethnography field sequence. I began my field practicum for that class, spending about 8 hours a week following anti-trafficking fairs and markets throughout Southern California. It was here where I first saw jewelry being sold, and I spent many, many months helping sell jewelry at different venues. I assisted with all matters related to the business side of operations, including collecting inventory, packing and shipping jewelry orders, liaising with customers, organizing and hosting jewelry sales, and participating in local outreach activities. It was about a year before I took my first trip with funding from the International Institute to visit the shop floor in Beijing and Bangkok. There, as a participant observer and volunteer, I worked making jewelry with workers for 8 hours a day over the course of 3 summers. During the work week, I organized different leisure activities for workers, craft activities, educational workshops. I helped translate in Chinese for English-speaking groups that visited, and I also accompanied workers as they prepared meals, shopped, went to internet cafes, and sometimes took extended weekend trips with them to visit their hometowns. In both cities, I spent about half of the day actually making jewelry and the other half of the day assisting with different kinds of administration, programming, and outreach. So Cowboy Rescue and Freedom Footprints were independently founded in 2005. And when I began my research in 2007, I was really surprised to learn that neither organization was aware of the other's existence. Yet since, the number of organizations that claim to leverage the marketplace, and particularly those that have turned to jewelry making or sewing, have grown exponentially, perhaps best highlighted by the multinational nonprofit organization Not for Sale, which boasts, as you see here, a freedom store that sells goods made by trafficked people around the world. In navigating the dual identities of social enterprise, both organizations register as 501c3 nonprofits in the United States, but as private corporations in China and Thailand. And it's really interesting because activists maintain this duality between work and reform, between profit and transformation through their shop floor practices. So for instance, in Bangkok, workers at Cowboy Rescue begin the day huddled around a time card machine, eager to clock in by 9 a.m. and then hurry over to a nearby church to begin the day with Christian worship. A single sheet of paper sits in back of the worship hall where workers can sign in if they've arrived late. Latecomers log their names and indicate the times they arrived at church to the minute, as each worker is penalized 2 baht or 10 cents for each minute she is late. After making jewelry for the remaining 7 hours of the day with an hour break for lunch, the workday ends promptly at 5 p.m. where workers clock out and disperse across the vast Bangkok metropolis. Some share rooms in high-rent apartments nearby in central Bangkok, where others travel as far as 2 hours away to find affordable housing. Rather than returning home, other workers like Go, an employee for 4 years, commit to part-time jobs in the service industry in order to earn an additional income because their Cowboy Rescue salaries do not sufficiently cover their living expenses. So the 213 passage of a Thai minimum wage law to 300 baht or $10 a day revealed that the Cowboy Rescue salary is just at the minimum wage, even though workers do receive medical insurance and weekends off, unlike the majority of low-wage migrant workers in the city. Go and Pon, the woman described at the beginning of this talk, are part of a staff of over 100 workers who have left their jobs as sex workers to become jewelry makers at Cowboy Rescue. Pon described to me how when she first joined, she was startled that she was required to sign a contract agreeing that she would no longer sell sex, nor would she patronize any of the bars where she used to work. During my residence in Bangkok, this behavioral contract was patrolled by mandatorily requiring workers to submit their Facebook passwords so that the organization could monitor the sexual activity of its workers online. The requirement that workers no longer see friends or visit environments where sex is being sold, even if they are not selling it, is intended to prevent the women from, as one activist claimed, quote, recidivism into the sex industry, end quote. Speaking of sex and sex work as addictions, activists mobilized the transnational moral panic against sex as a disease that may be conquered via wage labor, good taste, and appropriate Western femininity. The transnational racialization of Asian women's errant sexuality has been charted by numerous ethnic studies scholars, including some in this room. However, these scholarly accounts had not yet documented Western activist strategies for taming such deviant sexuality. And as a tool of both instruction and correction, jewelry becomes the perfect antidote for what activists say lost women. And this is a broad label that includes sex workers, the homeless, single mothers, drug and alcohol addicts, because as one activist noted, quote, the act of making jewelry restores femininity to where femininity has been lost, end quote. Such rescue organizations inextricably weave their rehabilitation narratives with that of monolithic sexual victimization, which never lets their employees define for themselves their former jobs as sex workers. Similar measures link wage labor and moral transformation through vocational training in Beijing, but they are justified and amplified through the authoritarian regime's control over civil society organizations, over religious organizations, over organizations working in the issues of sex work. To maintain a low profile away from government censorship, the Freedom Footprints office is in a remote, small Beijing suburb outside of the Fifth Ring Road by the airport, where the organization can maintain really, really close control over its workers. Workers at Freedom Footprints produce upwards of 300 pairs of earrings a day, and a single whiteboard sits in front of the production room to remind workers of the very strict production quota system that determines their wages. So unlike in Thailand, Chinese workers must produce jewelry with greater speed and in larger quantities because the majority of the country's distribution outlets are through wholesale venues, and this is a direct result of China's close monitoring over this different kinds of free market American enterprise. And this is a really interesting contrast to Bangkok, where sales are driven by a highly sophisticated inventory system that matches individual orders with individual production. But internet sales are really difficult to coordinate behind China's notorious internet firewall, as well as the different restrictions posed to foreign and religious organizations. And so these restrictions in sales and marketing are just one of the possible reasons why the organization in Beijing has grown far more slowly, employing at most 20 workers at a time, as they lack outlets to the free market, limited venues for sale, and freedom and fear of censorship. Freedom Footprint workers also start each day by clocking in at 9 a.m., and Chinese workers also earn the equivalent of a minimum wage salary for a 40-hour work week. While workers in Bangkok rent independent apartments, housing in China is actually mandatory, which is quite appealing to a consumer base that cares about human trafficking. So promotional materials boast free trafficking shelters, complete with access to things like computer training, mental health resources, and spiritual counseling. But workers shared that China's tradition of post-socialist iron rice bowl provisions meant that almost all migrant workers frequently slept in dormitories near or even on site to their workplaces. So this was no different than than what they saw here, where they slept 6 to 8 on a cluster of tightly knit bunks in a room. What was different from other work done outside of the rehabilitation context, however, was how the shelter life, how dorm life was also an exercise in practicing reform. So dorm life was managed by what were called house moms, and this reflected a very pervasive maternalist discourse that pervaded both organizations. And it really meshed well with activist beliefs that family values, that bad culture, that bad family values were one of the root causes of human trafficking. Shelter house moms enforced nightly curfew at 10 p.m., for which workers were once again penalized with wage deductions for each minute that they were late. And like in Thailand, Chinese workers also needed to sign a contract that forbade sex work, premarital sex, and abortion. Though Chinese state-owned enterprises have long provided benefits and security like food and housing to workers, this organization was able to reframe these offerings within the contemporary rights-based rehabilitation regime for trafficked people. And under the guise of victim protection, or what Jennifer Musto coins carceral protectionism, mandatory shelter housing and wage labor combined become essential parts to a sex worker's path to freedom. Selling what activists call slave-free jewelry alongside activists at a secular anti-trafficking conference in Pasadena, California, I listened as volunteers were boastful about the transformative effects of this jewelry making and were eager to share, quote, "Our girls are not required to participate in Bible study." So hearing this, the secular audience gladly opened their wallets to quote unquote buy for freedom. But what activists fail to mention is that workers are required to make jewelry through the hour if they choose not to go to Bible study. Thus, all attend for the break in manual labor that it provides, though none of the women in China has converted. And so this strategic obfuscation of the demands of religious transformation alongside manual productivity make faith-based organizations now often indistinguishable from the near hundreds of anti-trafficking projects working around the world. Freedom Footprints and Cowboy Rescue's work is unique because it spans borders, engages activists, consumers, producers in the growing fight to end trafficking. But because jewelry is made with an international and a particularly English-speaking clientele in mind, all of the promotional materials are in English. That means that while jewelry producers finger through the pamphlets on a daily basis, attaching earrings to cardboard or stuffing jewelry bags with cards that tell you, quote unquote, about this purchase, jewelry producers in Beijing and Bangkok did not always know the meaning of the content of this promotional materials that they were touching every day, though they could clearly see the price that the jewelry was being sold for. Working alongside Freedom Footprints workers in Beijing one day, I was asked to translate the English content on the promotional materials. It read, Xiaoli was raised in an impoverished family with only enough money to educate one child. Her brother was chosen to attend school. As a young girl, Xiaoli was forced to work. While she was only 17, her parents sent her out into a life on the streets. She was desperate and without hope until she was rescued by volunteers from Freedom Footprints. As I finished this translation, I sensed a growing discomfort swelling amongst the group. I asked workers what was wrong, and they said that this narrative represented, quote, distorted parts of some of their lives, end quote. They explained that the fictitious Xiaoli was a mass amalgamation of different challenges each of them had faced growing up in rural farming communities, but that none of them identified with the absolute sense of despair or rescue that this narrative claimed. This prompted me to ask the workers how they understand the term trafficking, which in Chinese is translated to guaimai, literally meaning kidnapped and sold. The 4 women workers I sat with were shocked to learn that this term was being used to describe their lives. And so while these portrayals of victimization and extreme hardship glorify tales of salvation and make for exceptionally compelling marketing materials, these portrayals betrayed the fact that workers identified with a host of other social identities, including but not limited to sisters, mothers, wives, and workers. In Thailand, workers were incensed when I translated promotional material that suggested that Buddhism was the reason why rural Thai families, quote unquote, sold their daughters, end quote, into the sex trade. What is the reason we have such a large commercial sex industry in China, they asked? It's because of the Americans. All were aware of the strategic foreign policy set in place by then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to assign Thailand as the site of military rest and recreation during the Vietnam War. Viewed as a legacy then of US militarism, as opposed to backwards religious or cultural norms, would really shift the way we approach interventions to sex work today. And it is precisely for these damning legacies of US militarism and US imperialism that make it ever more acceptable that the likes of Tim Ballard and Glenn Beck are able to amass millions of dollars in donations to bring paramilitary personnel and machinery to the policing of Thai women workers. Over the past decade, as workers have told me about the different reasons they came to Beijing and Bangkok, I learned that almost all had migrated to the city seeking different forms of low-wage employment. And in fact, workers find it really strange that so many vocational training programs want to teach them how to sew. In Thailand, one worker explained to me that she spent years working in a factory that produced clothes for H&M. She told me about working 18-hour days with no paid overtime, having to wear a diaper on the assembly line because line managers wouldn't let her take bathroom breaks, and experiences with being sexually assaulted with no recourse. These pervasive conditions of global garment work have been described and advocated for decades, yet they are oddly and notably absent from the US anti-trafficking efforts' goals towards rescue. And the irony is really gripping. Quote, "I've been sewing my entire life," she told me. "It was escaping sewing that brought me to sex work. So how is sewing or making jewelry now supposed to be any different?" End quote. Many sex workers recognize sex work as hard work with its own complicated set of opportunities and constraints. And they see their position as jewelry makers as just another low-wage job within a limited economy. But many also consider the job of lesser status as well, finding the rote character of wage labor and the consistent monitoring of social behavior of considerably less dignity and autonomy than characterize their experiences with sex work. But drawing on a host of symptoms related to the perceived vulnerability of Asian women, including gender discrimination, poverty, unequal access to education, American organizations equate third world poverty with human trafficking and a pervasive skepticism that a third world women's choices can be dignified if they are made within constraints. These narratives garner immense sympathy and financial support for these NGOs, but they do little to raise worker salaries beyond the minimum wage. Workers who succeed in rehabilitation programs remain there because of another calculated choice. Some sex workers echoed what labor scholar Chris Tilley in this room told me early on in this research, that these programs are merely retirement strategies for exit from sex work when they have become older, pregnant, or enter into long-term relationships. Many others quit, but find limited opportunities for upward mobility because they find limited opportunities for upward mobility relative to daily social control. But when they do quit, they are merely reabsorbed back into the low-wage migrant workforce, and after years of training, often find that they still have no viable vocation. Freedom in the eyes of workers ultimately is the ability to choose, though unfortunately, autonomy over decision-making is often decreased within rehabilitation. For Nan, an employee at Freedom Footprints for 5 years, her moral contract became an issue when we celebrated her 43rd birthday. And though her contract forbade her from socializing with the same friends she had made while working as a sex worker, against the rules, she decided she wanted to visit a pool hall nestled amidst corrals of go-go bars where she had worked as a sex worker for over 15 years because she wanted a glass of really good wine, and she said that was the only place that had it. So I'll share a final field note from my research. Walking through the crowded streets, our eyes darted back and forth cautiously before we reached our destination, and once inside, we chose a table in the furthest corner of the bar to avoid being seen by her current employers, as she was in violation of her contract. Once settled, Nan shook her head and pointed to her right shoulder where the Thai word for freedom was still stitched on her uniform. She remarked sharply, quote, "I must wear this uniform to work every day, but my boss doesn't let me choose where to celebrate my own birthday. Do you think this is freedom?" End quote. Nan likely doesn't mean this as a gesture of resignation, but posed as an ironic statement made in her characteristically blunt and facetious tone, because she never really lets the moral restrictions of her contract dictate where she goes and whom she sees. And in fact, the next morning, she tells me that she will sleep in and miss church worship altogether, accepting the 120 baht deduction in pay that month as a birthday present to herself, because she's not Christian and thus considers worship as just one more form of labor. Rather than mobilize resources through the state, American evangelical Christian organizations have turned to the market, creating a transnational moral economy of low-wage women's work, where the traditional exchanges of wage for labor are supplemented with affective commitments between first world rescuers and their purported victims in the global south. Within such rescue programs, manual labor is embedded within the tactics of moral reform, collapsing transnational moral panics about sexuality and gender-based rights. The labor processes of reform work are often vividly contested by workers in these programs, but are largely invisible in sites of movement organization here in Los Angeles and other places where consumer activists optimistically champion the goals of transnational mobilization through the market. Echoing the irony posed by the worker who told me that sex work helped her escape sewing, we also see how these projects are scripted by racial ideas of what decent and appropriate work for low-wage women workers should be. Anti-trafficking rarely considers options like worker organizing that might offer real power to workers to launch their own contentious battles, preferring only to celebrate them when they are fragile, helpless victims in need of rescue. So what do workers want? When workers argue for sex work as work or say that they want rights, not rescue, they are demanding the ability to organize and fight for themselves. Herein is a call to move away from the sensationalism and exceptionalism around trafficking and to look towards everyday labor rights and needs of workers. But this is hard and not desirable because it necessitates us moving away from the melodramatic arc that is so compellingly visible in films like The Sound of Freedom. And it's not desirable because it requires wrestling with everyday forms of power and who we think really deserves this power. Workers want recognition for the worlds they're already building. In Thailand, the Empower Foundation has, for almost 2 decades now, founded the world's first sex worker cooperated bar. And here, this is what they mean when they demand one of my favorite slogans here, that they want solidarity, not sewing machines. Rather than corporate-led efforts to combat trafficking, they want the ability to organize their own workplaces. And this is kind of a tangential example, but in recent years, things like the California Supply Chain Transparency Act have anointed the responsibility on multinational corporations to draft anti-trafficking statements. So you'll see, large corporations, particularly here, I think this was like an Adidas an Adidas factory that have beautifully written anti-trafficking statements, but have vividly contentious battles still happening in their workplaces. And all of the millions of dollars that's been afforded to corporate supply chain transparency, to addressing trafficking at the level of supply chains, none of it has ever gone to really training workers in different ways of organizing themselves. Workers want accountability for legacies of US militarism and imperialism, for debt that caused and exacerbated rural to urban inequality. They've asked for redistribution. They've asked for a fair wage. They want transparency. And they really just want support and visibility for all the work that they're already doing to achieve these goals, but that are so often drowned out by the far more satisfying depictions of freedom and slavery posed by anti-trafficking interventions. Thank you.
Okay, so Elena is going to field her own questions, and so now I want to invite grad students to, kick off our Q&A with the question. So.
Yes.
Hi, this was really amazing, super insightful. I feel like you sort of touched on it a little bit, but are these moralistic rehab programs only suited for sex workers that are single women? Like, are sex workers that have families, are they not welcome in these spaces? Because I think about like the dormitories, it doesn't really sound like a place that you can bring a child, or like is it really around the idea of like a maternal or paternalistic control over single women with no family members?
Thank you so much for your question. So in China, the issue of shelter housing was really a huge conundrum, because the antithesis to trafficking for many of these organizations is actually marriage. And so many hoped that after becoming wage laborers, after doing dignified work, that people would follow down this other path where they would get married. But one of the most veteran workers did end up dating and getting engaged and marrying somebody. And once she did, she said, I have to go live with him now. And they were like, oh no, what are we gonna do? You're not gonna live in the dorm anymore. And so because she was the first person that this had happened to, they really struggled and they fumbled, and they allowed her to then, they took her off salary, but they allowed her to create pieces of jewelry, and they would pay her for, each piece that she made. She was also one of the most skilled designers, so they would pay her a higher amount for new pieces that she would design. But ultimately, that was never enough for her to keep up, to sustain an actual wage. And she's one of the people that I do follow in the book that kind of fails out of rehab for different ways. What's also really interesting is that she approaches me and says, look, I'm the main producer, I'm the main designer behind all this jewelry. Can you help me sell this jewelry at the same price that this organization is helping to? Thus exposing then how much you need these middlemen arbiters who do so much with their marketing, that we would try to set up pathways for her to sell jewelry independently. And of course, none of them would pan out. And then with respect to children, both organizations did offer free daycare for children. In China, it was less common to see children in the city because it's far more common for migrant workers there to leave children behind. And so there was definitely more of an urgency in China to earn the money and then just send it back to their kids, which is why, again, it fits this paradox that you're talking about, that you have to largely be single and not attached to other people too. So it worked fairly well in those instances. And in Thailand, because we had more of this come and go structure, 9 to 5, live where you want to, people were able to use that daycare resource, functionally, and drop their kids off when they went to school. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could say more about the like running Freedom Footprints, and do they use the word activist for themselves? Are they primarily from the U.S.? And what was your relationship or like time spent with them like?
Yeah, I want to be really honest and say I had the opportunity to, my advisor, Ching-Kwan Lee, who teaches downstairs, she invited me last semester to share this book, which was very intimidating. And her biggest criticism was like, as an ethnography, you did not capture, like you spent so much time trying to capture the voice of these workers that you failed to capture the intersubjective reality for activists themselves. And I agree, that's a total failing of this work, is that, and this is a reason why all ethnographic research, why qualitative research, is embodied, is political, is incredibly difficult. I struggled on the one hand, oftentimes, like really being at odds with being in a research site where I was so politically and ideologically at odds with people that I had to work with, where at the same time I struggled with a great fear that they would sue me because they have so much power. And these fears did come to light, not from them, but from another anti-trafficking organization that I look at in this book, threatened to sue the editorial board of the Anti-Trafficking Review that I sit on because of a similar piece of work that exposed the work that they were doing. And just as a shout out to that work, that's the work of Ghanaian sociologist Sam Okier, who has exposed the work of International Justice Mission in conducting illegal raids of child fishermen in Lake Volta in Ghana. And for years, he and collaborators have been exposing how American organizations have been taking money, alleging that there's child trafficking happening in these places, kidnapping people from rural fishing villages, and incarcerating them in Ghana's anti-trafficking shelters. But only this past summer did the BBC Africa's Eye expose that in their own incredible investigative reporting. Again, still to absolutely no accountability from the organization, but that was the organization that mired this other anti-trafficking organization in a lawsuit. So I struggled with hating these people, living with them, and so it made it very, very difficult, I think, for me to really capture sometimes their own humanity. I would say that as much as this is a project driven by an interest in markets, they did not see these as profitable undertakings. So these are people who have extensive missionary background experiences. They lived very humble lives. They were not paying themselves massive amounts of money. Where they were investing the large profits was not into their salaries, but into different kinds of new businesses, new church planting opportunities. So they invested a recent sum of money in Thailand to opening a coffee shop in the red light districts. And their idea was that if they bought a $10,000 Italian espresso machine, that they could lure people away from sex with the promise with a good cup of coffee. Yes, sir.
So powerful. And you kind of spoke about this a little bit, but you hold a lot of different identities and positionalities, right? You're scholar, activist, organizer, author, but you're also a friend to these workers as well. So I was wondering if you can speak about some of these various positionalities and identities you hold, and how this affected the way you navigated your research sites and your participants. Specifically, if you could talk about, if it affected the ease or difficulty in building relations with the workers and even the volunteers.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I was always inspired to do a global and multi-sited ethnography, and in that is a built-in sense of liminality, that you have to be able to travel across all these different places. And it was, of course, my American passport, and it was, of course, my ability to say I was a graduate student, and I had funding that allowed me to travel to all the places that I needed to go to be able to do this research. But it was my identity as a Chinese American, again, very liminal, that allowed me to be welcomed by activists because I could do these different tasks, but also in Chinese where I can speak fluent Mandarin, sit and really talk with workers in a way that many activists who cannot speak Chinese but are still on site are not able to. And I don't speak Thai, but I was lucky because many of the sex workers had learned a kind of basic English fluency from their work in sex work, and so that kind of helped me get by in that context. I think that there were a number of times where my closeness to workers became evident to the organizations as a problem in and of itself. So after I wrapped up ethnography with both of these organizations in like my third year of doing field work, we can often refer to this in social science terms as a point of like ethnographic data saturation, where I was beginning to see a lot of the same things over and over and over again. But really it was the place where like my presence was no longer welcome. And it was evidence in like two particular examples that I detail in the book. One, where a worker had taken me out to get like a beer after work because she wanted to talk to me about how her sister had just been arrested for being in possession of crystal meth, and implied in, she never directly asked me for money, but there was perhaps this implication that she was asking for a little bit of money. The very next day, I was called into the director's office and scolded for not forming relationships with workers outside of the organization because it would allow them to, as she said, triangulate resources. So she wanted the organization itself to be the only source of resources for people. And what it sounded to me was like she wanted to remove other forms of their ability to build community. But on the flip side, from her perspective, she wanted to say, you know, you're a really transient person and you're only going to be here till the end of the summer. Why should you be the person who somebody's coming to rely on when we're actually the people who are going to be here in the long run? And the second incident that was more funny, that workers often laugh about, was you'll often be in these spaces called upon spontaneously to pray upon different people. And one day, all of these, like the directors had assigned all of these workers to pray for me. So like it was this like lunch hour where then all of these hands were like over my head. And the things that they were vitally asking them to pray for me for was the fact that activists felt that I could not see the deeply like spiritual underpinnings of trafficking. And so every time I would come to them and I would say, you know, is there a real reason like why church worship needs to be a mandatory part of wage labor? They would say, like, we're not going to change these things because this is fundamental to how we understand trafficking. And until you understand that trafficking is a spiritual problem, you're not going to be able to, like, as a researcher, get it. So when my presence began to change the dynamics of what were happening in the organization itself, I did know that it was time to leave. Yeah.
I had a question. Could you share more about your experiences working with the sex worker organizers and activists in Thailand and China, and also talk about like some of their organizing strategies in addition to creating the worker co-ops?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important to note that unfortunately the example of the worker co-op, the Thailand's Empower Foundation, is very separate from jewelry organizations. So to my knowledge, nobody in the jewelry organization is connected with Empower's organizing. I found the jewelry spaces a rather bleak place for organizing in a contentious way. So workers were never successful in asking for a change to different things that they wanted. Anytime they asked for a kind of change, this resulted in like a more authoritarian way of policing their lives. And just as an example, workers in China in the mandatory shelter were really like, they were angry about the informal rotating set of chores that it was assumed that they would have to do every day after the work. Like it would be assigned every day by the house mom. You know, this person's responsible for cleaning, this person's responsible for the bathrooms, and it would always erupt into some sort of like fight. And so workers said, we don't want to do these chores anymore in the house. It's unfair. It's this, that, and the other. And rather than going through some sort of process to remove the chores or whatever, what they actually did was spend all this time to create a much more strict shelter manual guide that then listed exactly how many hours each person had to spend doing each of the chores, and then at the end of the process had everybody sign their name to it. So anytime that they would express a desire for something to change, organizations would see that as a way to further cement an already set of kind of what they felt were authoritarian work structures. And then I think the greatest forms of resistance were when people quit and when they continued doing sex work on the side. And those are both two forms of resistance that are largely invisible, because when you quit rehab, you are no longer going to be a part of these fantastical marketing materials. Your dissent in quitting is never going to be captured by anybody who's buying this jewelry. You just sort of fade away. But I really did think that it was important to document when and why people quit and what happened to them afterwards. And so I devote a whole chapter in the book to that. And then the last one that was really hard was people who continue doing sex work. There's so many people who continue doing sex work. Many found it, the reason they chose the job was because they enjoyed, the kind of reliable wage labor, but they also enjoyed being able to brag to their family members that they were working for an American company. So a lot of people took a lot of pride in being able to say, I work for an American company, as opposed to more shame from, admitting to family members that they were a sex worker. So this kind of clicked that respectability box and allowed them to continue doing sex work on the side. But that was one choice that I made, not to write about different workers who continue doing sex work, because there were already so many efforts to police the possibility of sex work happening at the contours of this organization that I did not want to expose this kind of resistance. And so I think that that's something we struggle with, when you research and write about resistance, is how you write about it and celebrate it without exposing it. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering if any of the women spoke to you about the work that they did, and they were being basically pressed to take ownership of their own lives. Because it seems like they're there to do wage labor with all the moralistic ideas of what they're supposed to be. And maybe perhaps there was more of a move towards getting them married, under which they'd become paternalistic and home, basically a housewife. So was there more of a push, or did they tell you at all for them to take ownership of their own lives?
I'm not sure what you mean by ownership, the workers themselves.
Well, I thought in terms of when you showed the picture of the collective. As a collective, you're owners. You are the owners of what you're doing. But with these different organizations taking the women in, they're basically there for wage labor. So is that the prospect, that I'm just going to be here as a wage laborer, and maybe this idea of perhaps from here I'll end up getting married and be able to have a so-called nuclear family and just not have to work anymore?
Yeah, I think that the reason so many workers have stayed as long as they have, because they do face a relatively bleak set of options in generally service or manufacturing occupations. And so they do see this as very, very similar to other kinds of work that they might have, but again, it has these different benefits attached to it. Marriage for workers wasn't at the forefront of their minds, but they often were obsessed with internet dating because it gave them an out to what they felt was very, very coercive home environments. And this is why, if you'll remember, I mentioned the China shelter really celebrated computer skills training, and they had 2 very old donated desktop computers in the dorm. But then every day people would fight over who got to do like online dating on the computers. So nobody was doing like Microsoft Word or Excel training. Everybody was just trying to like be on chat rooms. And so they actually just removed the computers because they wanted to, remove the possibility of workers like making these contacts in non-savory ways. So, I mean, I guess that maybe would signal that they're looking for marriage, but it was the dating that was kind of an escape for most people. And so I don't think that marriage was necessarily what they saw as an out. And I think they stayed in these jobs because they were very similar to other jobs that they had as opportunities.
So also I wanted to also make sure everyone knows we are opening it up for all folks for asking questions. So.
Yeah.
Thanks for your beautiful talk. My question was around the workers who were requesting like solidarity on the part of like Western people, and also kind of asking not to be like patronized, but to be recognized as agents within their own lives. And thinking about like how entrenched the paternalism sort of rescuer ideology is here in the United States, what do you think some interventions would be here in the US on behalf of like what we're doing here to try and unravel that ideology, like is in order to create a sense of solidarity with those?
Yeah, thank you for the thoughtful question. It's something I think we really wrestle with when we teach this issue. I teach a large undergraduate anti-trafficking class. A third of the class is about the mechanics that drive trafficking. A third is about when anti-trafficking interventions have gone wrong. And the last third is like, what now? When they're in that middle third, which is where we are right now in this semester, they are anxious, they are furious, they are idle. They're like, you're just telling me the same thing every time. You're just removing all the things that make me feel good and that I've learned my whole life, or like the ways that I'm going to change the world. You're just taking them all from, they're very angry, very angry. What are you telling me? You should just do nothing? So we're at the point in the semester where we have to teach, and I'm like excited to talk a little bit more about this question in the graduate seminar, is to like, how do we wrestle with that discomfort of not immediately having like this very, very neat solution to a problem when people are asking to address the structural issues that drive trafficking. It means that interventions are going to necessarily be very, very mundane. That, almost always sex workers in Providence now are talking about universal access to housing. And like, that's a big leap for some people to understand why universal access to housing or safe ability to cross borders is fundamentally related to these issues that are far easier to consolidate. So I think it's like a real emotional problem. I think it ties into like the immediate self-satisfaction that we've come to like know. It's tied into the satisfaction of these very, very satisfying social media posts that anti-trafficking organizations are able to offer you. We don't sit well with that discomfort, and Americans like to believe in the ability to act quickly, in this case, act by buying something, and for that to really just close that loop. And so like working with students on like, how do we all learn to sit with that discomfort that you're not going to solve all these problems in a day, that there will continue to be conflict, that even in these solutions are plenty of other kinds of conflict. Like we don't romanticize these. And then a more like resource-driven answer is that I and others are working on a call to just defund trafficking because it is so scandalous how much money is being made within the anti-trafficking rescue industry, that simply redistributing all of those funds, which by their nature are always very conditional on either the presence of somebody from the US or a particular Western script of dignity and morality, to just all these new models that we have on like universal basic income, mutual aid, which is fundamentally about unconditional cash transfers, the ability to give poor criminalized people the ability for them to decide how they wish to spend their own money, are important shifts in like policy and funding spaces that I think we can make. Garland, congratulations on your retirement.
Welcome back to campus, and thank you for this illustrative talk. I wanted to know if, during your research, you encountered any women that had been a part of the rehabilitation / jewelry making enterprise, left that, and then maybe found their way back.
Yes.
And so what might they have told us?
Yes. So many, I think the organizations do have a or the organization in Thailand has a 3 strikes rule, where if you violate, one of their rules, you'll be fired after three times. And so both for workers that quit and for workers who were fired, the organization was very welcoming in giving them second and third chances. And oftentimes workers would leave. One did go back to doing garment work and found that completely unsustainable and not dignified, and so she returned. Another returned when she was pregnant and said, like, I really can't keep doing sex work again. And so it did provide like a haven for people who would test out other options again in this limited economy. And when they needed a different kind of stability, they would come back. So there were many people who came and left. There was one who left in China for 5 years. She ended up having a kid, getting married, ended up like becoming a victim of domestic violence in that marriage, didn't know really how to get out of it. And so this still was like the most accountable, the best form of employment that she could rely on. So yeah, I think that it teaches us that the call of this book is not necessarily to shut vocational training programs down. It's that within their own structures, can you offer greater transparency to workers, when you're recruiting them, what they're even getting into? Can you offer more freedom around or just also transparency around what you are being paid to do? It constantly was not, you're told that you're going to be paid to make jewelry, and it's not until you are living there that it's clear that you're really being paid to do all of these other things as well. So they want a kind of transparency at the start. And then others want vocational training in other industries. So they really want vocational training in new industries that might actually give them like independence. So the one beautiful example out of Myanmar was an organization that was teaching women how to be motorcycle repair people and would give them like a kit that they could just travel along with and stop at any place on the road and just set up shop. But that's a kind of like dirty and gendered work that does not gain as much appeal, I think, as jewelry making. It doesn't offer a commodity to be sold at like holiday bazaars here. And then, of course, there are others, and then a set of outside of vocational training, others are asking for political education. Like, tell us a little bit more about this, like what we could have if Americans were actually responsible for creating the sex industry. The more they learn about these histories, the more they kind of widen the scope of what they realize they can ask for. Angela.
Thank you so much for your powerful presentation. And now I know why you were always needing to go to the borders to Beijing, Thailand, working with us. Anyway, so happy to see you again. You talked a little bit about different activities that you planned for the workers. I was just interested to know about some of those activities and how the workers responded to those.
Yeah, thank you. I was really excited to plan things like mapping activities. I thought like mapping gave people a chance to really story tell the different places that they came from, that there was such diversity in the different places that they were from. And so we would, we made this big map and people would draw and put pictures of the different places that they were from. Unfortunately, I write about this in the book. Sometimes my workshops would be used as like further coercion to workers. So I could only set up the workshops like on the weekends, and I'd set up this big, like really elaborate, whatever, game or exercise. And I remember one instance where it was like Saturday morning and everybody just wanted to like watch TV or be on their phones. They didn't want to like do another workshop. And I remember the like house mom coming down and like yelling at everybody and was like, turn off your phones. You have this volunteer from America who's like gonna here to teach you, and you're gonna have to like. And so I toned it down because it's like, you know, I imagine, oh, here's some, like, it seems kind of boring. Here's some other things we could do, because I was also living in the shelter, so I'd be like, let's do something fun. But really, people just wanted to like go to the mall and, you know, take walks and do anything, you know, the things that you want to do when you are working, and the things that you want to just do for your leisure don't always have to be productive. And so I felt that that was also something that I learned, was that I had to like tone down my enthusiasm for the like activities. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
I'm thinking about the moment in your talk where you recount translating from Chinese to English, this kind of affective, salvific language on the note cards that would accompany the jewelry being sold, such as the term guai mai.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that a number of the workers were kind of surprised, and they said that these narratives were semi-fictionalized, distorted, and kind of a misrepresentation of their pasts and their presence. Was there any resulting pushback or conflict with the NGOs that kind of resulted from this discovery? And could you talk more about their responses?
Yeah, thank you. It was only after really understanding what trafficking means to Americans that then they began to truly understand these like pitying gaze that often accompanied tourists and other like visitors to the site. So very often like consumers, missionary visitors, tourists, short-term volunteers would come, and they'd be given tour constantly. There was constantly tours, and there was like a very clear like large window that tourists could stand, and workers would be watched. Sometimes if you weren't behind the window, then you could like more audibly hear what they were saying, but they were speaking in English. And so it was only then that they realized, oh my gosh, like these people are looking at us with this particular gaze. Like first they imagined, oh, they're just coming to see how the jewelry is made. But it was after that they understood what was being said about them on these marketing materials that they began to understand how people saw them differently. And so though they never pushed back against the language on the cards, because they were told things like, hey, you have to learn like strategic marketing. Part of this is that we're training you how to be good business people. This is going to make your jewelry sell better in the United States. What does it really matter? It's not that it's not true. We know better how to like craft these stories. But what they did push back against was what they called like zoo hours. So they said like, no more, this is not a zoo. People cannot just come in and watch us work anymore. And that did result in a drastic reduction of how many people were able to come and watch workers work. But these organizations were always able to like deftly work this to their advantage, because then they would say to visitors, I'm so sorry, the reason why you can't see these workers is because they've been so traumatized in sex work and that they're undergoing this process of healing that we don't wish to further exploit them by allowing you to watch them work. And so every kind of resistance was reshaped by management as a way to further like complexify or from the eyes of people who were visiting, as a way to further remove their agency. Yes?
Thank you for the talk. It's been illuminating. I was wondering if you could talk more, how do you define or think through labor versus work, especially dignified work under these constraints? And whether you like agree or disagree with international law or other kind of approaches to that definition. And then second, I don't know the right way to frame this, but maybe how does that inform how you understood or how your interlocutors understood exploitation versus agency or maybe coercion versus independence, based on this kind of definition of what type of work is dignified versus kind of coerced.
Thank you. So something really interesting that the Empower Foundation did was they created a companion manual to the ILO standards on decent work. And in that, they mapped out all the different kinds of sex work along a continuum of exploitation or decency according to like what the ILO regarded as decent work. And they did this to show that sex work is like other types of work, and you have to look at the different kinds of like labor relations and labor process of it in order to even begin to understand when exploitation happens. So again, none of these sex worker rights activists are saying that there are not structural conditions of exploitation inherent in sex work, but they're saying two things. A, those are the same kinds of root cause vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to exploitation in other kinds of work that are not sex work. And B, we are the best people as sex workers who are working in these industries, who do outreach on a daily basis to actually find the people and assist the people who are in situations of extreme exploitation. And so work in that instance, I think really is thinking about like a specific like labor process. And I think labor, the way that I use it, the way that other people are using it, more invokes like a broad, like, I think invokes like Jennifer's work on like care and intimacy and like these political identities outside of just like the wage for the production, but like it maybe encompasses all the different kinds of transactions that might be done across all of these different kinds of jobs. And then, yeah, I think we use the language of agency versus exploitation. I don't think they use it that much. I think that they think about things in terms of like voice and power and what they have the ability to change. I think that oftentimes anti-trafficking, like those who take a very abolitionist stance to sex work and sex trafficking will say, nobody can consent to being a sex worker because A, who would want to do this is fundamentally exploitative, and these women are only choosing this because they have no other options. So coercion is often mapped onto the idea of choice and what choices are available. I think that's a really problematic way in which coercion is formalized by the West, by Western feminists, by law. I think that workers who are making complicated choices from a limited set of decisions still consider those to be really valid choices. They don't necessarily consider those to be coercive. Thanks. Yes?
They're also obligatorily, this is not obligatorily, but like, I know everyone said it, but this is really something. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, sorry if I've missed, like, touching on this, but like, is there, like, no level at which, like, among these activists who are themselves kind of in a particular, or like these missionary folks, right, who are not like living rich off of the spoils necessarily themselves, but are certainly have access to making certain kinds of decisions, like the $10,000 espresso machine, right? Is there no function, like level, no group among them that are like, what about a living wage for these people? Like, or like even like the women themselves being like, hey, enough, like our friend the one who's able to get married is trying to get a little bit more money for her designs, like are just like, there must be that conversation, right, like often, so like where's it going and how, that's not a fully formed question, but I think you get what I'm getting at.
Yeah, thank you. I think that because the jobs were paid just at the minimum wage, but because they got these other benefits that other workers didn't get, they felt like they had to be grateful, and they felt very, very little power in being able to ask for a higher wage. So that was one thing, that there was, the wage was the same, but you got Christian holidays off, you got the weekend off. That's, really, really unheard of in both contexts. And so they did feel like grateful for the little pieces that nudged them slightly above other people in their situation. And then on the other piece, oh my gosh, I was going to say something. I lost it. It's going to come back to me. Thank you.
Yeah, well, this is a question I'm sure falls beyond your ethnography, but I'm hoping you can help me sit with a little less discomfort. I'm just wondering, your focus is on sort of U.S. organizations, U.S. government, U.S. voice in the UN. There are certainly arenas of global policy where other countries, other global NGOs, other voices have counterbalanced. I'm wondering if there are sort of institutional voices out there that are making some of the same critiques that you're doing within the UN, within the ILO, beyond these sort of great grassroots initiatives that you're going into.
I think that Amnesty International is making very, very interesting strides by coming out publicly in support of decrim. I think that we're seeing public health organizations really also take the lead. Shout out to Dr. Susie Baldwin, who's also formative to my education here and is leading, I'm gonna just have you shout out this hearing from yesterday. But the really dire public health consequences of bad anti-trafficking policing, if policing is not compelling enough, public health officials these kinds of entities have made progress this way. And I think the UN is so confusing because, I think absolutely the ILO is, I think it's telling that the sex worker rights organization chose to partner with the ILO protocol over IOM, International Organization of Migration, is still fundamentally interested in the framework of migration management, which is about upholding the borders as they exist and working with migration within these contexts of highly criminalized borders. So they don't really support what the IOM is doing. But I think the UN is so strange because so half of this book's research is I worked in 2 UN anti-trafficking offices in Beijing and Bangkok, and they too are so drawn to the anti-trafficking money that they have an absurd array of weird anti-trafficking acronyms, projects, programs that you see popping up everywhere, from the Super Bowl to the airports. Anytime you see signs alerting you to the presence of human trafficking, it is coming from these different UN, but also partnering with health and human services and other places like that. But I do think there's a move towards decriminalization, towards worker rights, and some international and global governance entities are taking that on. And there's important work being done right here in Los Angeles. Please contact Susie in the bandana if you'd like to know more. Very important forays in LA.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you for such an inspiring work. I really enjoyed reading your book and listening to this book talk. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the grassroots movements of sex workers in Thailand and China, regarding what kinds of alliances they are making to make this movement progress and step forward. I'm from South Korea, and there is an emerging sex workers movement in South Korea. And even though that emerging sex work movement uses the same slogan of sex workers work, and they are demanding some policy changes regarding poverty, such as basic income or something like that. But still, the existing mainstream labor movements are really indifferent, at least, and sometimes hostile, because maybe they are also sharing the same moral premises. Instead, South Korean movements had making alliances with disability activists because under the slogan of deinstitutionalization. So that was my question, what's happening in Thailand and China, and if there are international alliances of sex worker movements, I would also like to hear about that.
Thank you so much. I'm just taking notes so I don't forget again. In Thailand, the Empower Foundation, one of the largest US or UK based movements that they ally with is the Wages for Housework campaign. So they're fundamentally interested in poking through these ideas of paid and unpaid work. But something very, very interesting that they did was that they worked with a bunch of regional sex worker rights organizations that were part of ASEAN, and they created SWASEAN, which is the sex workers of ASEAN. And the logo is really beautiful because it takes like the ASEAN logo but turns it into a corset, and they meet every year in like 11 different countries of ASEAN to talk about different ways of like political organizing. So they use like that regional economic bloc as a way to consolidate their activism as well. In China, something that's really interesting is that labor organizations, like non-sexual labor organizations, have not taken any anti-trafficking money, and they do not want to. And I've asked them time and time again, you know, like people organizing the like apple factories in southern China, like, you know, if you just say you're working on trafficking, you can get all this money. And they're like, this is not trafficking. So it's partly this definition of trafficking in China is not the same as other people see it, but also workers were like, no, this is not, you know, we're working on a very specific kind of like mundane labor struggle, and we've seen how the Chinese government is using, the Chinese government has done a lot to use anti-trafficking as a way to promote its own like political goals of policing. And so there's been a resistance on behalf of Chinese labor organizations from joining the anti-trafficking movement. And then the last interesting solidarity from this photo is actually this is a sit-in strike inspired by like United Auto Worker tactics that was brought to Myanmar through the Solidarity Center's work in Bangkok. So this is kind of a good gesture towards traditional U.S. organized labor and what it is trying to do in these new contexts.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to CPSC for hosting us in this week's hour.